Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. I should have trusted my gut the moment I stepped into that house. It wasn't just the damp smell that hit me like a slap. Mold, old wood, and something faintly metallic, like pennies left out in the rain. It wasn't even the dim lighting that turned every corner into a shadowy void. No. It was the feeling. That heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on me as soon as I crossed the threshold, like the house was watching me. The floorboards groaned under our weight as we entered, each step announcing our presence to whatever dwelt within these walls. I noticed how the air seemed to thicken around us, almost viscous, making each breath feel labored. The wallpaper, a faded floral pattern that might have been cheerful decades ago, now peeled at the corners like diseased skin curling away from infected flesh. I knew something wasn't right, but I told myself to man up. We were here because we had no other choice. Mission rules didn't matter when you didn't have a roof over your head. The woman who owned the place, Sister Wilcox, waddled ahead of us, her wide frame brushing against the walls as she led us to our room. She didn't say much, just muttered something about us making do. Her voice was thin and raspy, like the air in the house. As we climbed the narrow staircase, I noticed photographs lining the walls, old black and white images of people I didn't recognize, their eyes seeming to follow our ascent. One particular photo caught my attention. A family of 4 standing in front of this very house. But something was wrong with their faces. The longer I looked, the more distorted they appeared, as if the photograph itself was diseased. When she opened the door to our room, I had to bite back a grimace. Room was generous. It was more like a shoebox someone had lined with cheap paneling and called livable. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a sickly yellow light that made everything look jaundiced. 2 twin beds, crammed together with barely enough space to walk between them, and a closet that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. The closet door was painted white, but age and moisture had warped it, creating patterns in the wood that resembled screaming faces if you looked at them from the right angle. I tried not to look. "This'll do," she said, more to herself than to us. Her small, watery eyes flitted over me, lingered for a beat too long, then turned to my companion, Elder Russo. Something in her gaze made my skin crawl. Not predatory exactly, but knowing. Like she was in on a joke we weren't privy to yet. "Dinner's at 6, she added before lumbering off, her footsteps heavy on the creaky floorboards. As she left, I caught a whiff of her perfume, sickly sweet, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. "Cozy," Russo muttered, tossing his bag onto one of the beds. His Italian accent made everything sound less sarcastic than it probably was. He was trying to lighten the mood, but even his usual cheerfulness seemed dampened by the oppressive atmosphere of the room. I tried to shake off the unease as I unpacked, telling myself this was temporary, just a few days until the mission office found us another place. But the feeling lingered, a nagging itch I couldn't scratch. As I hung my clothes in the musty dresser, I noticed scratch marks on the inside of the drawers, deep gouges in the wood, as if someone had clawed at them desperately. The first night, I couldn't sleep. Russo snored softly on the bed next to mine, his steady breathing the only sound in the room. But something kept me awake. Maybe it was the faint creak of the house settling, or the way the shadows in the corner seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The darkness felt alive, pulsing with an energy that made my skin prickle. I stared at the closet door, its faded wood grain catching the light in strange patterns. The warped surface created an optical illusion. Sometimes it looked like the door was breathing, expanding and contracting ever so slightly. I told myself it was just my tired eyes playing tricks on me. Around midnight, the temperature in the room dropped noticeably. My breath came out in small puffs of vapor, despite it being late spring. The cold seemed to emanate from the closet, seeping through the cracks around the door like invisible fingers reaching into our room. I don't know how long I lay there, but at some point, I must have dozed off. I woke up to the sound of my name. Michael. It was a whisper, soft but distinct. My eyes snapped open and my heart hammered in my chest. I glanced at Russo, who was still snoring, then at the closet. The door was slightly ajar. I hadn't noticed it before. I was certain, absolutely certain, that it had been closed when we went to bed. The gap was maybe 3 inches wide, revealing nothing but impenetrable darkness beyond. Michael. It came again, this time louder, more insistent. My skin prickled, and my mouth went dry. The voice didn't sound human. There was something wrong with it, like multiple people speaking in unison but slightly out of sync with each other. I told myself it had to be my imagination, a leftover thread from a half-remembered dream. But the voice didn't sound like something conjured by my subconscious. It sounded real, close, like someone standing just behind the closet door. I sat up, my movements slow and deliberate, and stared at the crack of darkness inside the closet. My pulse thudded in my ears, drowning out everything else. The darkness beyond the door seemed to move, writhing like something organic. "Russo," I whispered. No response. I reached over and shook his shoulder, but he just grunted and rolled over. His sleep seemed unnaturally deep, and for a moment I wondered if something in the house was keeping him under. The voice didn't come again that night, but I didn't sleep. I sat there wide-eyed, watching the closet until the first light of dawn seeped through the window. As the sun rose, the oppressive feeling in the room seemed to lessen slightly, but it never fully disappeared. The next day, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Stress. Fatigue. The mind playing tricks in an unfamiliar place. But when Russo asked why I looked like I hadn't slept, I couldn't bring myself to tell him. What would I even say? That I thought the closet was whispering to me? We spent most of the day out on our bikes, visiting houses, knocking on doors. The fresh air and sunlight helped clear my head. But dread built in my stomach as the day wore on. I knew we'd have to return to that house, to that room, to that closet. During our rounds, I asked some of the neighbors about the house on Ashwood Lane. Most gave me strange looks and changed the subject quickly. One elderly man, however, pulled me aside. "You boys staying at the Wilcox place?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. When I nodded, his face went pale. "Be careful," he said. "That house, it's not right. Never has been. Things happen there. Bad things." Before I could ask what he meant, he hurried away, glancing nervously over his shoulder as if afraid someone might have overheard. By the time we got back, I was bone tired, the kind of exhaustion that made your legs feel like lead. But as soon as we stepped into that house, the unease came rushing back. The air felt thicker than before, almost syrupy, and there was a new smell, something organic and wrong, like meat left out too long. Dinner was the same bland casserole as the night before, served with Sister Wilcox's unsettling stare. She didn't talk much, but when she did, it was always something strange. That night, she fixed her watery eyes on me and said, "You know, some houses have memories, and some rooms. Well, some rooms are better left shut." "What do you mean?" I asked, my fork suspended halfway to my mouth. She smiled, revealing yellowed teeth. "Oh, you'll see. The house always shows people what they need to see, or what it wants them to see." Russo tried to engage her in conversation about her family, the neighborhood, anything normal, but she would only respond with cryptic half-answers and that unsettling smile. That night, I made sure the closet door was shut tight before I climbed into bed. I even jammed a chair against it just to be safe. Russo teased me for it, calling me paranoid, but I didn't care. "You'll thank me when nothing disturbs our sleep," I said, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to my own ears. But the laugh died in my throat when I woke up in the middle of the night to find the chair moved aside and the closet door wide open. This time, it wasn't just ajar, it was completely open, revealing the darkness within. And the darkness seemed wrong somehow, too dark, as if light simply couldn't penetrate it. It was like looking into a void that went on forever. The voice was back, clearer this time, and it knew my full name. "Michael Andrews, come here." The voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight, a sense of command that made my stomach churn. It reverberated through my bones, making my teeth ache. I wanted to scream, to wake Russo, but I couldn't move. It was like something had pinned me to the bed, invisible hands pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. My breath came in shallow gasps as I stared at the open door, the darkness inside seeming deeper than it should have been. Like it wasn't just shadows, but something alive, watching me. I could feel its attention on me, heavy and oppressive, like being stared at by something massive and hungry. The paralysis wasn't just physical, my mind felt trapped too, unable to form coherent thoughts beyond pure primal fear. Time seemed to stretch and distort. Minutes felt like hours as I lay there, helpless. Then I saw it. In the depths of the closet, something moved. Not quickly, but with deliberate slowness, like it wanted me to see it. A shape forming in the darkness. Tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that bent in ways that shouldn't be possible. I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed. When I finally managed to move, every muscle in my body screamed in protest, as if I'd been frozen in place for hours. I didn't dare look inside the closet again. I just reached over and shook Russo awake, harder this time. "We're switching beds," I blurted when his eyes finally opened. "What? Why?" He grumbled, groggy and annoyed. "Just trust me. Please." Something in my voice must have convinced him because he didn't argue further. We switched beds in silence, but I noticed him glancing at the open closet door with newfound wariness. I didn't sleep a wink for the rest of the night. I lay in the bed farther from the closet, watching, waiting. Around 4 in the morning, I saw Russo's body stiffen in his sleep. His breathing became labored, and his fingers clutched at the sheets. Whatever had paralyzed me was now focused on him. I wanted to help, to wake him, but fear kept me frozen in place. After what felt like an eternity, he gasped and sat up, his face covered in sweat. "Did you—" he started, then shook his head. "Never mind." But I knew. He'd heard the voice too. By the third night, I was ready to leave. Rules be damned, I couldn't spend another night in that room. My nerves were frayed, and I'd started jumping at every small sound. Even during the day, I felt watched, followed by something just out of sight. But Russo convinced me to stick it out. "A few more days," he said, though his usual confidence was notably absent. "We can handle a few more days." That afternoon, I searched the house while Sister Wilcox was out shopping. I needed to understand what was happening. The other rooms were locked, but I found a narrow door under the stairs that opened into a cramped storage space. Inside, among boxes of moldering clothes and forgotten photographs, I found newspaper clippings. Dozens of them, yellowed with age, all about the house. The headlines made my blood turn to ice water. Family of 4 found dead in Ashwood Lane home. Police baffled by mysterious deaths. 7th tragedy strikes notorious house. The articles spanned decades. Different families, different circumstances, but always the same result: death, madness, or disappearance. And in several of the articles, survivors mentioned the same thing: voices from the closet in the upstairs bedroom. That was the night I woke up to find the scratches. 3 long parallel lines across my abdomen, perfectly straight and evenly spaced. They didn't bleed, but they burned like fire, as if someone had dragged red-hot wires across my skin. The pain was so intense it brought tears to my eyes. I stumbled to the bathroom, my hands shaking as I lifted my shirt to stare at them in the mirror. They were too precise, too clean. Not something I could have done to myself, even unconsciously. The skin around them was raised an angry red, and when I touched them, they felt ice cold despite the burning sensation. When I returned to the room, Russo was sitting up in bed, his face pale in the moonlight. Without a word, he lifted his own shirt. 3 identical scratches marked his chest. "We need to leave," he said simply. I nodded, but when we tried to pack our things, we found our bags had been moved. They were in the closet, pushed far back into that impossible darkness. Neither of us was willing to reach in to retrieve them. When I asked Sister Wilcox the next morning if she had any pets, her response sent shivers through me. "No pets," she said, smiling faintly. "But you know this house is haunted, don't you?" She didn't wait for my reply. She just shuffled off, humming to herself, leaving me alone with the gnawing realization that whatever was in this house wasn't done with me yet. But this time, I followed her. She went to a room I hadn't noticed before, at the end of a hallway that seemed longer than the house should accommodate. She unlocked it with an old brass key and slipped inside. I crept closer and peered through the keyhole. What I saw defied explanation. The room was filled with mirrors, hundreds of them, all different sizes and shapes, covering every surface. And in each mirror, I saw a different reflection of Sister Wilcox. Some showed her young, others ancient. Some showed her with features that weren't quite human. Too many teeth, eyes in the wrong places, limbs that bent backwards. She stood in the center, talking to the reflections as if they were old friends. "They're almost ready," she said. "Just a few more nights. The closet is doing its work." One of the reflections, a version of her with hollow black eyes, responded in a voice I recognized. It was the voice from the closet. "The younger one is strong. He resists." "They always do at first," Sister Wilcox replied. "But the house is patient. The house has been feeding for over a century. It knows how to break them." I backed away, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. We had to leave. Tonight. That evening, Russo and I made our plan. We would wait until Sister Wilcox went to bed, then slip out quietly. We'd leave everything behind, our bags, our bikes, everything. Our lives were worth more than our possessions. But the house seemed to sense our intentions. As night fell, the atmosphere grew heavier than ever. The walls seemed to pulse with malevolent life, and the whispers from the closet became a constant stream of voices. Dozens, maybe hundreds, all calling our names. We sat on our beds, fully dressed, waiting. Sister Wilcox's footsteps creaked overhead around 10 o'clock, then silence. We waited another hour to be sure. "Now," I whispered. We stood, but the moment our feet touched the floor, the closet door burst open. Not slowly this time. It slammed against the wall with enough force to crack the plaster. The darkness inside began to spill out like liquid shadow, creeping across the floor toward us. In that darkness, I saw them. The previous occupants of this room. Dozens of faces, twisted in eternal anguish, reaching out with desperate, grasping fingers. Their mouths moved in silent screams, and their eyes, God, their eyes were gone, replaced by swirling voids of darkness. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Russo's arm. We bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The handle turned, but something held it shut. Behind us, the darkness crept closer, and with it came the cold, a bone-deep freeze that made our muscles seize. "The window," Russo gasped. We rushed to it, fumbling with the old latch. The darkness was almost upon us when finally, Blessedly, it opened. We didn't think about the two-story drop. We just jumped. I hit the ground hard, pain shooting through my ankle, but adrenaline kept me moving. Russo landed beside me with a grunt. We ran, limping and stumbling, not stopping until we reached the main road. When we finally dared to look back, the house on Ashwood Lane stood silent and dark. But in the upstairs window, our window, I saw Sister Wilcox. She wasn't alone. The shadows writhed around her, and for just a moment, I saw her true face. Ancient, inhuman, hungry. She smiled and waved. We left the city that night, hitchhiking until dawn. The mission president was furious when we showed up at his office, disheveled and wild-eyed, but something in our faces must have convinced him. He transferred us immediately, no questions asked. I still have the scars. 3 parallel lines across my stomach that never fully healed. They ache sometimes, especially at night, and when they do, I hear whispers. Not words, just the faint echo of voices calling from a darkness that should not exist. I later learned that Sister Wilcox's house had been condemned years ago after a family of missionaries disappeared there. Officially, it should have been empty, but the house on Ashwood Lane doesn't follow official rules. It has its own needs, its own hunger, and somewhere, in some city, it's still feeding. Still calling names from the darkness of an upstairs closet, waiting for the next unsuspecting souls to answer. I pray you never hear your name whispered from the shadows. And if you do, don't listen. Run. The crisp autumn air stung my face as I stepped out of Josh's beat-up Subaru. Stretching my legs after the long drive from Chicago, I breathed in the earthy scent of pine and decaying leaves. A chill ran through me, though whether from the cold or a sense of unease, I couldn't say. At 28, I had thought a camping trip with my old college buddies would be the perfect escape. Between working 2 jobs to pay off my student loans and credit card debt, and helping my mom with her medical bills, life had become an endless grind. When Josh suggested we get together for a week of hiking and camping in the remote wilderness of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, like we used to do every fall, I jumped at the chance. Now, stepping into the deserted trailhead parking lot shadowed by towering hemlocks and white pines, a knot of anxiety twisted in my gut. We were miles from the nearest town, with no cell service and only the supplies in our backpacks. The untamed forest stretched endlessly in all directions. We're really doing this, huh? Josh flashed me a grin as he shouldered his heavy pack. His scraggly beard and flannel shirt made him look every bit the seasoned outdoorsman, but I knew he spent most of his days behind a computer screen like the rest of us. No turning back now, I said, trying to shake off my unease. Zach and Tyler were already marching down the winding trail, fishing rods and bear spray dangling from their bags. The 4 of us had spent countless weekends exploring the woods of Wisconsin and the Appalachians during college, but it had been years since our last trip. We weren't the young, carefree kids we used to be. The first few miles passed easily as we followed the trail deeper into the forest. Golden aspens and red maples shimmered in the afternoon sun. Josh and Tyler swapped stories of their latest dating escapades while Zach, ever the eagle-eyed birder, kept a running count of the species he spotted flitting through the branches. But as shadows lengthened across the forest floor and the temperature steadily dropped, my sense of foreboding grew. The trees pressed closer, blotting out the sun. Every snap of a twig made me flinch. It felt like unseen eyes were boring into the back of my skull. We made camp in a small clearing alongside a burbling creek, its waters stained amber with tannins from the leaf litter. After the heavy warmth of my sleeping bag all night, the chilly morning air raised goosebumps as I stumbled out to pee shortly after dawn. Fog coiled between the dark tree trunks and swirled across the forest floor. In the gray light, everything looked alien and menacing. I hurried to rejoin the others huddled around the campfire, cradling chipped enamel mugs of coffee. As I approached, Tyler held up his phone with a frown. Huh, that's weird. I could have sworn I had a bar of service last night, but now, nothing. An icy rivulet snaked down my spine. I'm sure it's just the mountains blocking the signal out here, I said. We're in the middle of nowhere. Speaking of, did any of you hear that sound last night? Zach asked quietly, bloodshot eyes peering over the rim of his mug. Almost like a woman singing, except... He shook his head. Except what? Josh pressed. It didn't sound human. The melody was like nothing I've heard before. It was haunting. Almost. A shrill cry pierced the fog, cutting him off. We froze, staring wildly into the mist swirling between shadowy trunks. The wailing rose in pitch, before dissolving into guttural, choking sobs that made my skin crawl. Then, as suddenly as it began, the woods fell silent. What in God's name was that? Tyler whispered. No one had an answer. One by one we turned to look at each other, and I saw my own fear reflected on my friends' ashen faces. Something was out there in the mist. Something that didn't belong. And we were utterly alone with it. The eerie cry still echoed in my mind as we broke camp with shaking hands. Zach, ever the rational one, tried to convince us it must have been an animal. A fox, maybe, or some strange bird. Didn't sound like any bird I've ever heard, Josh muttered, shouldering his pack. The shadows under his eyes betrayed his own unease. We set off along the trail in silence, jumping at every rustle in the underbrush. Though the sun inched higher, the fog clung stubbornly to the forest floor, obscuring our path. Twice, Tyler swore he saw a pale figure darting between the distant trees, but it vanished before any of us could spot it. As we trekked deeper into the wilderness, an oppressive stillness settled over the woods. The birdsong that had filled the air yesterday was conspicuously absent. Even the insects seemed to have fled. Only our own labored breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath our boots broke the heavy silence. By midday, we stumbled across an abandoned campsite nestled in a small glen. The ashes in the stone fire ring were cold, but a faded blue tent sagged forlornly between two trees. Yellowing newspapers and crushed beer cans littered the ground. "Hello?" Josh called out. "Anyone here?" Only the wind whistling through the pines answered him. Unease prickled at the back of my neck as we crept closer to investigate. The flap of the tent hung open, fluttering in the breeze. Josh poked his head inside and immediately recoiled, face ghost white. "What is it?" I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Sleeping bags. 2 of them. And they're shredded. Practically torn to ribbons like some animal went berserk in there." Tyler let out a low whistle. "Maybe we should head back," he said, eyes darting nervously to the tree line. "Tell a ranger or something." But the trail had vanished, swallowed by the mist. We were lost in a sea of skeletal trees and shifting shadows with no idea which direction we'd come from. Every scraggly trunk looked the same. "We'll follow the creek downstream," Josh decided, taking charge. "It has to let out somewhere. Just keep your eyes peeled and stay close." As we filed out of the clearing, I spotted a flash of color caught on a briar. A tattered red flannel shirt, snagged and torn, just like the one Josh was wearing. Icy tendrils snaked around my heart. This was more than just some random abandoned campsite. Something had happened here. Something horrible. And now that same something was stalking us through the wilderness. We slogged on in fearful silence, the creak of trees and gurgle of the creek our only companions. Zach kept obsessively checking his phone, desperately hoping for a bar of service. But the no signal icon mocked him from the screen. Without warning, Josh froze in his tracks, motioning for us to stop. He cocked his head, listening intently. At first, all I could hear was the rasp of my own shallow breaths. Then, from deep in the woods, came the unmistakable snap of a branch, followed by another, and another. Footsteps, drawing closer. "Run!" Josh croaked. "Run!" We crashed heedlessly into the underbrush, thorns raking our faces, panic choking our throats. Behind us, the footsteps quickened, growing louder, until they thundered like war drums in my ears. A shadow flitted through the trees to my left, then another on the right. They were flanking us. My lungs seared and my muscles screamed in protest, but terror spurred me faster, leaping over fallen logs and ducking under grasping branches. Ahead, Josh and Tyler sprinted wildly through the trees, but Zach lagged behind, wheezing with each step, his face beet red with exertion. I slowed to let him catch up, just as a blood-curdling shriek rent the air. Zach's eyes bulged in horror an instant before an impossibly tall, spindly figure burst from the shadows and slammed into him, bearing him to the ground in a flurry of flailing limbs and flying leaves. Paralyzed with fear, I could only watch as the creature hunched over Zach's thrashing form, emaciated arms working furiously. Wet, ripping sounds churned my stomach. His screams cut off with a choking gurgle. The thing straightened and swiveled its head in my direction, milky eyes standing out starkly in its gaunt, bone-white face. A skeletal grin split its blue-tinged lips, and that's when I saw the crimson dripping from its long, gnarled fingers. The creature took a lurching step toward me, black tongue lolling obscenely between needle-like teeth. I stumbled backward, a scream building in my throat, then turned and fled blindly into the trees. Branches whipped my face and snagged my clothes as I crashed through the undergrowth, heedless of direction, knowing only that I had to put as much distance as possible between myself and that nightmarish thing. Zach's dying screams echoed in my mind, mingling with the ragged huffs of my breath and the thunder of my pulse in my ears. Tears blurred my vision. I had abandoned him, left him to die in the clutches of that monster, just to save my own skin. Self-loathing twisted in my gut like a knife. After an eternity of panicked flight, I burst from the tree line onto the muddy bank of the creek, now a raging torrent swollen with recent rains. Josh and Tyler were nowhere in sight. Doubling over, I braced my hands on my knees and gulped air, trying to calm the mad hammering of my heart. A twig snapped in the brush behind me. I spun around, a hoarse cry escaping my raw throat, but it was only a rabbit bounding away into the ferns. The woods suddenly seemed too quiet, the silence heavy and watchful. I strained my ears for any sign of my friends, or of the creature that had taken Zach, but heard only the gushing of the creek. Wiping my sweaty palms on my jeans, I tried to get my bearings. I had no idea how far I'd run or in what direction. The overcast sky offered no clues. For a moment, I contemplated shouting for Josh and Tyler, but fear of drawing the monster stilled my tongue. If it found me alone, exhausted and unarmed. A shudder ripped through me and I pushed the thought away. I needed a plan. Find Josh and Tyler, get back to the car, get the hell out of these godforsaken woods. But which way to go? The creek cut through the forest like a winding snake, offering no indication of the shortest path back to civilization. As I hesitated, a flicker of movement across the creek caught my eye. I squinted, hope leaping in my chest. But it wasn't Josh or Tyler stepping out from the trees. It was a girl, barefoot and wearing a tattered white dress, her long dark hair obscuring her face. For a moment she stood motionless on the opposite bank, her pale arms wreathed in mist. "Hello?" I called out. "Are you lost? Do you need help?" The girl didn't react to my voice. An eerie stillness emanated from her, the kind only ever found in the presence of the dead. Goosebumps raced up my arms as she lifted her head, achingly slow. Black voids stared out from a ghastly white face where eyes should have been. A scream froze in my throat. She raised one skeletal arm, pointing a long, bony finger directly at me. Then she spoke, her voice a rasping whisper, that somehow carried across the roar of the creek. The harvest comes. The gods must feed. Malice dripped from every word. I stumbled back a step, then another, my legs gone rubbery with terror. When I blinked, the girl had vanished, leaving only mist swirling over the churning waters. The gods must feed. A fragment of an old folktale surfaced in my panic-fogged brain, a story I'd read in one of Zach's books on local legends. Whispers of pagan deities worshipped by the ancient tribes that once inhabited these woods, dark rituals carried out in their name. Rituals that demanded blood. Rituals that had never really stopped. Zach's voice echoed in my head, the conversation we'd had around the campfire 2 nights ago coming back to me with sickening clarity. He'd been reading up on the area, he'd said. Wanted to check out some of the old tribal sites scattered deep in the forest. The pieces clicked together with a horrifying snap. Zach had been searching for something out here, and he'd found it. Only it wasn't ancient history or forgotten myths. It was a nightmare made flesh. And now it had a taste for us. With shaking hands, I fumbled my phone from my pocket, desperately stabbing at the screen. No signal. Not even a single bar. The useless device nearly slipped from my sweaty fingers as despair crashed over me in a suffocating wave. I was about to stuff it back into my pocket when I noticed the notifications blinking up at me. Voicemails. 3 of them, all from Zach. My breath caught in my throat. He must have called sometime yesterday before we lost service. I hit play with a trembling thumb, pressing the phone to my ear. Zach's voice, tight with barely suppressed excitement, crackled through the speaker. "Hey man, it's Zach. I know this is gonna sound crazy, but I found something out here. Something big. I've been researching these woods and the tribes that used to live here, and I think I figured out where they held their rituals. The ones where they supposedly sacrificed to their gods." Sacrificed. The word tolled like a funeral bell in my mind as I remembered the thing I had seen crouched over Zach's body in the woods, blood dripping from its gnarled fingers. "I'm gonna check it out, see if there's any truth to the legends," Zach continued, oblivious to the horror his words evoked in me. "Just wanted to let you know in case, well, you know, if anything happens. But I'm sure it'll be fine. I'll tell you all about it tomorrow." The message ended, and the next one began. This time, Zach's voice held an undercurrent of tension. "Me again. I found it. The altar, I mean. Just like the stories described. It's real, man. All of it. The symbols carved into the trees, the stone circle, the offerings." He trailed off, and I could hear him take a shaky breath. A chill spider walked down my spine. When he spoke again, his voice was little more than a whisper. "I'm not alone out here. I saw something watching me from the trees. I don't know what it was, but it definitely wasn't human. I'm getting out of here. I never should have come out to this place on my own. I'll see you back at camp." The voicemail ended with a click. A jolt of anger briefly cut through my fear. Why hadn't Zach told us any of this last night? If we'd known what he'd found, that he thought something had followed him back. But I already knew the answer, bitter as wormwood on my tongue. None of us would have believed him. We would have laughed it off as just another one of his half-baked conspiracy theories, the product of an overactive imagination fueled by too many obscure subreddits. And so he'd kept quiet, even as the thing that had stalked him in the woods crept ever closer to our camp. To us. The final voicemail blinked on the screen. I stared at it for a long moment, a leaden ball of dread settling in my gut. Bracing myself, I tapped play with a blood-slicked finger. This time, there was no preamble. Only Zach's ragged, panting breaths and a single word, uttered like a desperate prayer. "Run." Then the line went dead. A guttural moan punched from my chest as the reality of my best friend's death crashed over me. Zach was gone, torn apart by the nightmare he'd unwittingly summoned from the depths of the ancient forest. And Josh and Tyler were still out there, oblivious to the fact that they were now being hunted. I had to find them, had to warn them before it was too late, and... A flicker of motion at the edge of my vision wrenched me from my spiraling thoughts. My head snapped up, adrenaline screaming through my veins as I scanned the tree line for any sign of the creature that had butchered Zach. But it was a human figure that stumbled out of the shadows of the towering firs. Josh. His flannel shirt was ripped and muddy, his dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. Relief surged through me, so intense it nearly buckled my knees. "Josh!" I croaked, lurching toward him. "Thank God. Where's Tyler? Zach is... There's something out here. We have to go now, before..." The words died in my throat as Josh staggered closer and I saw his face. Blank, milky eyes stared out from ashen features gone slack and strange. His head lolled at an unnatural angle on his neck, as if no longer fully connected. And then I saw the gash, a jagged, gaping wound that nearly encircled his throat, crusted with dried, blackened blood. This wasn't Josh. Not anymore. It was a husk, a puppet dancing on strings jerked by an unseen hand. As I watched in mute horror, his arm slowly raised, one stiff finger unfurling from a clenched fist to point at something behind me. A soft rustle sounded at my back, and every hair on my nape prickled with primal terror. I spun around just as a tall, emaciated figure detached itself from the shadows of the trees. The same bone-white grinning visage I'd glimpsed crouched over Zach's corpse stared back at me, its depthless black eyes swallowing all light. Viscous ropes of saliva dripped from rows of jagged teeth, through which an impossibly long black tongue slithered. "I've made my offerings, little mouse." An oily voice slid through my mind, alien and terribly ancient. Now it's time for the gods to feast. In the next instant, it was upon me. Adrenaline surged through my veins as I threw myself to the side, barely avoiding the creature's grasping claws. I hit the ground hard, rolling through the mud and bracken, wincing as broken branches gouged my skin. The thing let out a furious shriek, whirling to face me, its gaunt chest heaving with rage. I scrambled backward on my elbows and heels, my heart battering itself against my ribs. In the back of my terror-blanked mind, a single thought crystallized. I was going to die here. Alone in the ancient forest, far from home, my bones left to bleach beside the rotting remains of my friends. Despair crashed over me as the creature stalked closer, its lipless mouth peeling back from its jagged teeth in a nightmarish grin. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing myself for the piercing agony of those wicked claws shredding my flesh, the snap of my bones between its unnatural jaws. But the killing blow never came. A furious bellow echoed through the trees, followed by a heavy thud and a gut-churning squelch. My eyes flew open to see Tyler standing over the prone form of the creature, chest heaving, a large branch gripped in his gore-splattered hands. He'd caved in the back of its skull, black ichor oozing from the gaping wound. "Tyler," I croaked, hardly daring to believe my eyes. "How?" "Tracked you," he panted. "Heard you scream. Nearly got turned around in this damn mist." He held out a hand, hauling me to my feet. "Josh?" I shook my head, tears burning my eyes as I jabbed a trembling finger at the dark figure slumped at the edge of the trees. Tyler blanched, but said nothing. "Zach's dead too," I said hollowly. "That thing, it tore him apart." Jesus. Tyler scrubbed a hand down his face. "What the hell is going on out here?" The whole sordid story spilled out of me in fits and starts. Zach's research into the area's bloody history, the ancient altar he'd discovered in the woods, the voicemails I'd found on my phone. As I talked, Tyler's face grew grimmer, his knuckles white around the gore-streaked branch. "We have to get out of here," I finished, my voice ragged, "before any more of those things find us. I passed an old ranger station about a half-mile south of here, Tyler said, squinting against the growing gloom. If we can make it there, we might be able to radio for help, or at least hole up until morning. I glanced at the creature's still form, its bone-white limbs askew, the tree branch protruding obscenely from its caved-in skull. Bile scalded the back of my throat. Even dead, it seemed to emanate a sense of wrongness, of something that didn't belong in our world. Tearing my gaze away, I gave Tyler a sharp nod. Lead the way. We crashed through the underbrush in silence, leaping over fallen logs slick with moss and rotted leaves, hearts pounding in time with our echoing footfalls. The mist clung to the forest floor in writhing tendrils, turning the twilit woods into a surreal dreamscape. Every shifting shadow seemed to conceal a gaunt, grasping figure. Every skittering sound, the footfalls of our relentless pursuers. What felt like hours later, we staggered into a small clearing dominated by a dilapidated wooden structure, its tar paper shutters hanging askew on rusted hinges. A faded Forest Service shield was still barely visible on the weathered door. "Thank God," Tyler gasped, stumbling toward the sagging porch. The door shrieked as we shouldered it open, the blackness within seeming to swallow the thin light filtering through the trees. I groped along the wall until my fingers closed around the plastic cylinder of a flashlight. Dim yellow light sputtered to life as I clicked it on, illuminating a Spartan interior thick with dust and cobwebs. An ancient radio sat on a rickety table against the far wall, its long antenna drooping. Tyler lunged for it, frantically twisting the dials. The speaker remained stubbornly silent. He slammed a fist against the scarred wood with a strangled curse. "Batteries are dead," he spat. "Useless." An icy tendril of despair snaked down my spine. We were cut off, alone in the dark heart of the forest with only a few moldering walls between us and the horrors stalking us. And no one knew where we were. I collapsed into one of the camp chairs scattered about the room, my head sinking into my hands. Hot tears pricked my eyes, spilling over my fingers to patter on the dusty floor. We had nowhere to run, and our time was running out. I could feel it in the hungry shadows pressing close beyond the thin walls. The gods must feed. Suddenly, Tyler shot bolt upright beside me, his eyes wide and wild in the guttering flashlight beam. "The old stories," he said, his voice thick with barely suppressed hysteria. "The ones Zach was talking about around the campfire. The rituals, the sacrifices. What if they never really stopped?" I stared at him, not comprehending. He grabbed my shoulders, his fingers biting painfully into my flesh. "What if we give it what it wants?" he said, his gaze boring into mine with feverish intensity. "Make an offering, like the tribes used to do. Maybe then it'll let us go." "An offering?" I repeated slowly, the words tasting like ashes on my tongue. The image of the creature crouched over Zach's mangled corpse flashed behind my eyes, and my gorge rose. I wrenched away from Tyler's grip, bile searing my throat. "No," I croaked. "No way. I'm not going to feed anyone to that thing. This isn't some goddamn fairy tale, Tyler. Zach and Josh are dead, and we're probably next. Playing into its sick games isn't going to change that." Tyler's face twisted, ugly desperation distorting his features into something almost unrecognizable. "You don't know that," he hissed. "This might be our only shot." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words died on my lips as a long, eerie howl drifted through the rotten walls, raising every hair on my arms. Shadows flickered past the grimy windows, there and gone too quick to follow. They were here. The children of the dark wood, come to claim their due, and we were out of time. Tyler's eyes darted wildly between the door and the shuttered windows as the eldritch howls outside the cabin grew louder, closer. His chest heaved with panicked breaths, fingers spidering through his matted hair. "I can't die here," he choked out. Not like this. Not like... His voice cracked. Not like them. A splintered crash from the rear of the cabin made us both flinch violently. They were trying to get in, bony limbs battering the rotting wood, jagged teeth gnashing in hunger. It was only a matter of time before they succeeded. Tyler rounded on me, something wild and desperate contorting his mud-streaked features. "It's the only way," he said. "The only way either of us might make it out of these woods alive. You must see that." "No," I said, my voice trembling. Tears blurred my vision as I backed away from my last remaining friend in the world. "I won't. I can't. Then I will." Tyler's words dripped with grim finality. He snatched up the flashlight and lunged for the door. I stumbled after him, screaming his name, begging him not to do this, not to succumb to the twisted games of the dark gods in the wood. But he was already gone, vanished into the mist-shrouded night. Within moments, the beam of the flashlight winked out, swallowed by the hungry shadows. And then the screaming began. I sank to my knees on the sagging boards of the porch, sobs racking my chest. I clamped my hands over my ears, rocking back and forth, but I could still hear it. The wet, tearing sounds, the crunch and snap of bones, and underneath it all, the slick, satisfied chewing of the creatures as they feasted. The gods must feed, and feed they had. On my friends, on their blood and bones and screaming flesh. While I cowered in the dark, too paralyzed with terror to do anything but listen to them die. Floorboards creaked behind me. My head snapped up, tears still streaking my cheeks. A tall, emaciated figure stood framed in the doorway, backlit by the guttering lantern on the table. Viscous ropes of saliva and gore dangled from its long jaws. My legs moved of their own accord, plunging into the mist-shrouded night, blind and heedless to any destination save escape, knowing all the while that there was none to be found. Not from the darkness, or the truth it had shown me. As I hurtled through the ghostly trees, briars tearing at my clothes and skin, bitter self-loathing coiled in my gut. I'd abandoned them. Josh, Zach, Tyler. I'd let them die one by one, offering them up to the nightmare lurking in the shadows in exchange for a few more moments of my own wretched existence. But the hungry gods in the wood would not be denied their due. They had marked me, the last living soul to witness their terrible acolyte. No matter how far I fled, how desperately I tried to escape the hellish taint of their touch, I would never be free. Their corruption coiled in my very marrow. My foot snagged on a gnarled root and I went sprawling face first into the mud and rotting leaves. I pushed myself to my hands and knees, chest heaving, filthy fingers scrabbling for purchase on the forest floor, only to freeze as my right hand closed around something round and smooth. Trembling, I raised my fist, uncurling my fingers a fraction at a time. It was an eye, milky white and staring, with clumps of torn, bloody flesh still clinging to the back. I reared back with a choked scream, only to cover my mouth in numb horror as I took in the rest of my surroundings. Blood-spattered bones littered the small clearing, glinting dully in the meager light. Gnawed ribs here, a femur there, an arm, still bearing shreds of plaid flannel. Hot bile scorched the back of my throat. They'd brought me right back to where it had all begun. The scene of the first slaughter, Zach's slaughter. As if to mock me with its brutal reminder one last time before they claimed me too. But why had they pursued me all this way across the shadowed miles, only to toy with me now? What more could they want when they'd already taken everything? Unless... A lone tree in the clearing caught my eye, crooked branches twisting toward the clouded sky like grasping claws. A familiar symbol was gouged deep into the bone-white bark, a crude spiral with a single staring eye at its center. The same symbol I'd seen in Zach's notes. The sigil of the old gods, The gods he'd been so desperate to prove were real in order to vindicate a lifetime of obsession. An obsession that had driven him into their waiting arms. And damned us all. Staggering to my feet, I lurched toward the tree, stomach roiling with a suspicion too awful to name. Steeling myself, I placed my hand over the symbol, fitting my palm against the whorls and ridges. The world tilted, shadows twisting at the edges of my vision. My ears popped painfully at a sudden drop in pressure. Gasping, I snatched my hand away. The symbol was gone. In its place, the knotted bark had smoothed to form a small rectangular door, flush with the wood. The door creaked open under my trembling fingers with a soft snick. Numb, I reached inside the lightless hollow within. My hand closed around a bundle of smooth, stiff papers. Zach's notes. The ones he'd claimed were lost, scattered in his flight through the woods, hidden away all this time in the dark heart of the forest, waiting for me to find them. Forcing down the bile searing my throat, I pulled the sheath of paper into the weak light. A single sentence glared up from the topmost page. They must be fed, so that I might become. No, it couldn't be. Not like this, not him. A dry twig snapped behind me. I whirled to see a tall, emaciated figure detach itself from the shadows between the grasping trees. Viscous saliva dripped from its wicked jaws. Eyes like the void between stars stared out from its bone-white face. But it wasn't the creature's nightmarish visage that froze the blood in my veins and sent me crashing to my knees in the loam. It was the tattered red flannel hanging from its gaunt, gray-skinned frame. The same flannel that Zach had been wearing that first night around the campfire. The last night I'd seen my friend as he was before he'd led us all into the waiting darkness. Before he'd fed his humanity to the hungry gods of the wood and been reborn as their child. Zach, or the thing that had once been Zach, took a gliding step forward, dead leaves crackling under its bare, bone-pale feet. I scrabbled backward until my spine hit the rough bark of the tree. There was nowhere left to run. His notes fluttered from my numb fingers, fanning out across the forest floor, their awful truth laid bare. Why? My voice cracked on the single broken syllable. Tears burned my eyes, carving tracks through the grime caked on my face. Why did you do this? Zach's head cocked at an unnatural angle, milky eyes boring into mine. When he spoke, his voice was a dry rasp, thick with rot and ruin, as if dragged across eons of oblivion. You know why? He said. You read my notes. I sought the old ones. Those that came before, dwelling in shadow. I found their sigils carved in these ancient trees, and I called to them. But why? I demanded again, choking on the bitter betrayal rising in my gorge like black bile. Power. The single word slithered from Zach's withered lips, cold and inexorable as the grave. True power, beyond the petty confines of mortality. The gods showed me the way. But their blessings come with a price. Fresh horror dawned, putrid as a bloated corpse. The ritual, I breathed. The offerings. The gods must feed, Zach intoned. Shadows writhed at the edges of my vision, hungry darkness gathering close. And you, dear friend, you will be the final sacrifice. My last tie to the frail world above, severed and supped upon. Please, I begged, my voice cracking. Please don't do this. I know you're still in there somewhere. Remember who you are, Zach. Remember everything we... The rest of my desperate plea gurgled to nothing as Zach's hand clamped around my throat, cutting off my air. He lifted me bodily from the ground until my feet kicked and dangled over the loam. His flesh was cold and unyielding as a drowned corpse. I remember, Zach said, his lipless mouth peeling back from his needled teeth in a terrible mockery of a smile. And I don't care. Spots swam in my vision, my oxygen-starved lungs screaming. Darkness crept in from the edges, narrowing to a single point of cold light. I could feel the shadows twining around us now, impatient, ravenous. The gods come to feast. With one last burst of desperate strength, I lashed out, clawing at those balefire eyes. Zack jerked back, more in surprise than pain. His grip loosened, just for an instant. But an instant was enough. I wrenched free, staggering to my hands and knees on the carpet of bones. My chest heaved as I gulped blessed air. Behind me, Zack let out a low hiss, fury and hunger vibrating in the eldritch sound. But I was already moving. Flinging myself at the sigil carved into the tree, I gouged at the staring eye with torn nails, my breath sobbing in my throat. Zack howled in rage, a sound that raked like icy claws down my spine. The eye disappeared under my bloody fingers, the whorls of the symbol smoothing into a small, dark portal, just like before. This was how he'd done it, how he'd invited the horrors into our world, and how I'd send them back to the abyss that spawned them. Zack was on me before I could think, skeletal hands hooked into claws, scratching and tearing. I screamed as I felt the flesh of my back shred under his inhuman strength. But I didn't need strength for what came next. Only will. Only the whispered words that spilled from my cracked lips. And the blood that was my birthright to shed. One final offering. One last vital spark spilled on hallowed ground to close the circle and return the shades to shadow. I saw understanding flare in Zack's eyes an instant too late. He screamed then, a sound like all the anguished souls in hell keening at once. The sigil blazed like foxfire, and the smell of ozone stung my nose as ethereal fire consumed him from within. Eldritch winds howled through the clearing, whipping the trees into a frenzy as the veil between worlds tore open once more. "No!" Zack wailed, his body unraveling, dissolving into the maelstrom. "I cannot go back! I will not be banished to—" But the rest of his furious denial was lost to the shrieking gale as the gateway to the other side opened its gaping maw and devoured him whole. The last thing I saw before blessed oblivion claimed me was the mangled remains of my friends scattered on the forest floor, their glassy eyes staring towards a sky they would never see again. And then there was only darkness. 6 months later, the world knows nothing of true darkness. The simple shadows that pool in familiar corners and under lonely beds are no more than a child's fancy compared to the black abyss that dwells deep beneath the skin of creation. In those fathomless depths, horrors older than time slither and crawl, waiting for some hapless soul to crack the seal and call them forth into the light. But the light is not where they belong, and there must always be those who stand against them, who offer up the coin of blood and soul to send them back to the inky void from whence they came. I used to dream of a normal life, a mundane existence blessedly free of knowledge, of the burden of fighting a war older than memory, a life untainted by the eldritch dark that had seeped into my bones like sour sap. But that was before the woods and the darkness and the sigil carved in pale, dead flesh. Before I fed my friends to the abyss to seal the ancient pact anew. Now I am become the watcher in the trees, the final ward against the hungry gods. I tend the wards and carve the signs, my own blood the ink that binds the shadows to their starless realm. Just as those who came before me, just as Zack was going to do before the power corrupted him. Because someone has to. Someone has to hold the line, even if it damns them to the same pitiless vigil. The reckoning is coming, spoken of in whispers by the lost and the mad, when the seals will crack, and the ravenous shades pour forth to devour the world. And on that day, I'll be waiting for them, for a friend. My name is Ethan Miller. I'm 28 years old, and if you told me a year ago that I'd be a park ranger living alone in the remote wilderness of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, I would have laughed in your face. I grew up in the suburbs of Pittsburgh, went to Penn State, got a degree in business, and landed a cushy corporate job right out of college. Life was good. I had my own apartment, a solid group of friends, and enough disposable income to keep me entertained on the weekends. But then the pandemic hit. Our company struggled and rounds of layoffs decimated our department. I made it through the first few rounds, but eventually my name came up. With the job market in shambles, I found myself unemployed, unable to pay rent, and forced to move back in with my parents at the ripe old age of 27. As I wallowed in self-pity and tried to chart my next move, an old college friend reached out. He had been working seasonally as a park ranger for the National Park Service and told me they were desperate for workers, as many of their usual hires were older and at higher risk for COVID complications. "You're young and healthy," he said. "They'll take anyone right now. The pay is lousy, but you get free housing. Might be a good way to reset for a bit while you figure out your next step." I'd always loved the outdoors, camping, kayaking, going on long hikes to find a bit of solace away from the grind of daily life. The idea of waking up every day surrounded by nature had a certain appeal. After a few more weeks of fruitless job applications, I decided to go for it. I applied, interviewed virtually, and within a month I was packing my bags to head north to the Hiawatha National Forest of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. The drive from Pittsburgh to my ranger station in the UP took the better part of a day. As I made my way across Ohio, skirted the bottom of Lake Erie, then drove northward through Michigan, the scenery transformed from industrial to pastoral to just plain wild. Highways turned to country roads, towns got smaller and further apart. My little Ford Focus gamely chugged along, but as I entered the densely forested stretches on the way to the Hiawatha National Forest, I started to feel very ill-equipped for the terrain. My tires slipped precariously on the dirt and gravel roads. Not exactly the vehicle you'd want to be in if you had to make a quick getaway. I shook my head, wondering where that morbid thought had come from. I'd done plenty of solo travel before. In fact, that's how I preferred it. Just me, some good tunes, a fresh Spotify playlist to jam to. But there was something different about this trip. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the towering hemlocks and pines, a sense of unease began to creep over me. By the time I pulled up to the small rustic cabin that would serve as my ranger housing, full dark had fallen. I gathered my duffel bags, fumbled with the key, and let myself inside. The cabin was sparse but tidy. A small kitchenette, a table and chairs, a daybed tucked against the back wall, a bookshelf beside it crammed with old paperbacks and field guides, a cast-iron wood stove to serve as heat. I'd been told the place had once served as a fire warden's post nearly 100 years ago. As I looked around, I felt my earlier unease blooming into something closer to dread. What the hell was I doing here? A city boy playing Grizzly Adams out in the middle of nowhere? I didn't know the first thing about being a ranger. Who was I kidding? I barely slept that first night, tossing and turning on the narrow bed as the wind whistled through the eaves and tree branches scraped against the window panes. Every creak and groan of the old cabin sounded amplified in the stillness. I rose at dawn after a few fitful hours of sleep, chugged some coffee, and headed to the ranger station a few miles up the road for orientation. There I met my new boss, John, a 50-something-year-old ranger with a salt and pepper beard and a gruff demeanor. He welcomed me, introduced me to the rest of the small staff, and gave me a crash course in my duties, manning the visitor center, responding to calls, assisting campers and hikers, conducting light maintenance and trail upkeep. Pretty straightforward stuff. "Most of the time, this is a cake job," John said. "Hike around, pick up some litter, give tourists directions. But you always gotta stay alert out there. Folks get lost, hurt. Animals can be a problem. And sometimes..." He trailed off. "Sometimes what?" I asked. He fixed me with a level gaze. "Sometimes things happen out there that don't make a lick of sense. Just keep your head on a swivel and trust your instincts. Anything feels off, you hike your ass straight back here double quick, you read me?" I gave a shaky nod, a cold trickle of fear running down my spine. What could he mean by that? Before I could ask, he clapped me on the shoulder, breaking the tension. Let's get you fitted for your uniform and gear. The rest of the day passed in a blur as I filled out paperwork, learned the park radio codes and protocols, and studied trail maps. By the time I made it back to my cabin, I was exhausted again, my mind reeling with information overload. I ate a microwave dinner, read a few pages of a battered copy of Bill Bryson's A Walk in the Woods, and collapsed into bed. My first few weeks passed uneventfully as I settled into the routines of ranger life. I woke with the sun, patrolled my designated trails, and practiced identifying flora and fauna with my field guides. It was peaceful work, meditative even. Just the crunch of my boots on dirt and the chatter of birds and squirrels for company. But then the calls started coming in. "You're gonna want to head out to the Songbird Trail and check on a possible injured hiker?" John's voice crackled over the radio. I grabbed my gear and hoofed it to the trailhead. After a brisk 2-mile hike, I came across a man sitting on a rock clutching his ankle. "You all right, sir?" I asked. He looked up, startled, then grimaced. "Twisted my damn ankle on a root. Hurts like hell." I examined it gingerly. Didn't look broken, but was already swelling up. I radioed back to the station to let them know I'd need a hand carrying the hiker out. While we waited for backup, I made small talk, asking where he was from, what brought him out here. "Always wanted to see the UP," he said, wincing as he shifted position. My granddad used to tell me stories about it when I was a kid. Must have been nearly 80 years ago now. Said it was the most beautiful place on God's green earth, but that you had to respect it. Said there were things out there in the deep woods that you didn't want to cross. I laughed nervously. "What, like bears? Bobcats?" He shook his head. Granddad grew up with the Chippewa. Said they had stories, old stories, things the forest doesn't suffer lightly, beings that you prayed never to encounter. He shuddered. Granddad swore up and down he saw something once. Never would tell the whole story, but the way his eyes went distant and his voice shook. I'll never forget it. Said the only reason he escaped with his life was he had tobacco and an offering on him, something his Chippewa friends insisted he carry for protection. The hiker looked up at me, deadly serious. Never forgot those stories. Main reason I came out here was to see it for myself, walk in Granddad's footsteps. And let me tell you, sometimes at night, you can feel it watching. The forest knows we don't belong. Just then, a twig snapped in the dense brush off the trail, and the hiker nearly jumped out of his skin, crying out as he jostled his injured ankle. My head whipped around and I caught a flash of something moving between the trees. Too big to be a squirrel or raccoon. My heart seized. A bear? A moose? Or something else? The forest seemed preternaturally still, watching, waiting. After a tense minute, I called out, "Hello? This is Ranger Miller with the Park Service. Do you need assistance?" Nothing but the sound of branches swaying in the breeze. A bird cried out, sounding almost mournful. The hiker grabbed my arm, his eyes wide. "We shouldn't be out here alone," he whispered. "There's things in these old woods. Things we were never meant to see." As if on cue, backup arrived to help stretcher the man out. I kept a watchful eye on the trees the whole hike back. I tried to shake it off, telling myself the hiker was just spinning a tall tale, that the shadow in the woods had been a trick of the light. But his words continued to echo in my head over the next days and weeks. I found myself feeling increasingly on edge when out on patrols, the dense foliage taking on a watchful, heavy quality. I started at small noises, whipped around at the slightest rustle behind me, my skin prickling with a near-constant sense of unseen eyes upon me. I chalked it up to my city kid instincts misfiring out in the vast wilderness. And then the disappearances started. First, a pair of backpackers failed to return from a 2-night trip in a remote section of trail. We searched for days but found no trace. It was like they'd vanished into thin air. Figuring they'd just gotten lost, We widened our radius, scouring the dense and unforgiving terrain. On day 5, one of our search dogs found a single hiking boot, torn and bloodied, nearly a mile off trail. No sign of its owner. We kept looking. Then a family of car campers, their minivan parked at a trailhead, with all their gear still neatly unpacked inside. Pots, pans, sleeping bags, toys, even the half-eaten remnants of a lunch hastily abandoned. Park dispatch tried to reach them. Voicemails went unreturned and concerns deepened. This wasn't like a lost hiker. Something had interrupted this family's camping trip in dramatic, unsettling fashion, leaving a scene like one of those ghost ship mysteries where a crew vanishes without a trace. And still we searched, senses heightened, pulses quickening at every snapped branch or unexplained noise, but finding nothing. It all came to a head when we got reports of a solo female hiker who missed her scheduled check-in with family. Standard procedure was to give it at least 48 hours before officially launching a search, but with the strange events of recent weeks, we headed out immediately. By hour 12, I was bushwhacking through a remote section bordering state forest lands, miles from the nearest trailhead. These weren't even maintained park trails, just crude tracks used by hunters and local outdoors people. As I pushed further into the woods, that uncanny sense of oppressive heaviness weighed down upon me. My thumb caressed the bear spray canister at my belt, seeking reassurance in its solid heft. Overhead, birdsong slowly petered out, the air becoming thick and still. An eerie hush fell over the forest. The crack of a branch shattering the silence nearly stopped my heart. I spun towards the sound and dropped into a combative crouch. There, caught in a shaft of dappled sunlight, stood the missing hiker, still clad in her bright blue technical jacket. "Oh, thank God," I exhaled. "We've been searching everywhere for you. Are you injured?" But as I approached, the metallic scent of blood reached my nose, and the hiker's head slowly swiveled towards me, her movements stiff and unnatural. I froze. Her eyes, they were like two polished stones, hard and glinting, and utterly inhuman. She stared right through me, her face blank. Then her head cocked to the side and her mouth opened, and she spoke in a rasping, alien rattle. A sound no human throat should be able to produce. "Leave this place. Leave or be consumed. The forest knows. The forest hungers." I crashed through the underbrush, sheer panic propelling me through the woods back towards park headquarters, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Branches whipped my face and tore at my uniform. Behind me, an ungodly howl resonated through the trees, a ululating wail that sounded like the death screams of 1,000 elk. Primal terror gripped me. I had to get out of these woods. Now. By the time I burst into the ranger station, I was nearly incoherent with fear, babbling about the hiker, her dead eyes, the inhuman words spilling from her mouth. John took my shoulders, shaking me, trying to calm me enough to make sense. "Slow down, son. What in the Sam Hill are you talking about? You're saying you found the missing hiker?" "Yes!" I screamed. "But she wasn't human. Not anymore. Something had her." It sounded like a warning. No, a threat. That we were trespassing, and if we didn't leave... Oh God, John, what the hell is out there? A muscle twitched in John's cheek as he released me and ran a hand over his face. He suddenly looked much older, years of hard-earned forest wisdom weighing on him. "Look, son," he finally said. "There's things out there that defy explaining. Creatures that were old when the first humans set foot on this continent." He began pulling ancient-looking books from the station's shelves, field guides, anthropology texts, binders of old park records, and incident reports. The local tribes had stories, legends of beings that roamed the forests and needed to constantly be appeased lest they hunt and kill any humans who displeased them. Mayanganaki, they called them, hungry ones. Most folks dismissed them as myths, just so stories. But the old-timers, the rangers who were out here 50, 60, 100 years ago, they knew. They witnessed things. Dark things, unexplained things. He opened one of the binders to an old sepia-toned photograph of a ranger from decades past. The man stared out from the page, unsmiling, his eyes haunted. This was my granddaddy. Spent his whole life out in these woods. Started as a ranger, became chief ranger for near on 30 years. And he knew the stories were true because he saw them for himself. John flipped through the delicate pages until he found what he was looking for. An incident report dated from the 1920s, faded and brittle with age. He pointed to a line written in his granddaddy's spidery script. Evidence of disturbance. Human remains located 5 miles SW of Mosquito River trailhead. Bones appeared to have been snapped and gnawed upon by large predator. Unusual scratches on nearby trees inconsistent with any known wildlife. Tribal elders consulted. Say marks indicate presence of Mainganaki, ancient beings that dwell deep within the forest. Advise extreme caution in area. Cold sweat dripped down my back. This couldn't be happening. Mysterious monsters in the UP woods? Creatures even the Park Service had known about for decades? It was like waking up in my own personal horror movie. John closed the binder and fixed me with a heavy stare. Look, I don't know what you saw out there, but I know my granddaddy wouldn't have written about no Mainganaki if there weren't truth to the legend. The tribal folks around here still leave offerings out on the deeper trails, did you know that? Tobacco, beads, little bundles of sage, anything to appease the spirits, keep themselves safe. So what do? I asked desperately. We keep the tourists away from the deep woods. We don't let our people go out alone if we can help it. And we pray to God we don't rile the beings up any more than we already have. Easier said than done. As word trickled out about the disappearances, it only seemed to draw people to the forest. Thrill seekers, paranormal investigators, YouTubers eager to capitalize on a supernatural mystery. They came from far and wide, and no amount of emphasizing the potential dangers could dissuade them. A little girl vanished on a camping trip with her family. I practically yelled at one group I caught trying to hike out to the site of the backpacker disappearances. Do you understand that? Vanished without a trace. Whatever's out there, it doesn't differentiate between some adrenaline junkie ghost hunter and a child. The group leader scoffed. Your job is to keep this park open and accessible to the public. So unless there's a trail closure order, we have every right to be here. Now, if you'll excuse us. He shouldered roughly past me. I watched them go with a sinking heart, frustration and fear warring within me. How could I make them understand the gravity of the situation when I barely understood it myself? I knew only one thing for certain. The forest was angry, and each human that ventured too far into its depths risked incurring the wrath of beings beyond our comprehension. Over the next days and weeks, the crowds continued to grow. Sensationalized headlines splashed across social media. Mysterious creature stalking Michigan woods. Ancient evil awakens in UP. Despite the increasingly dire warnings from park leadership, people seemed drawn to the area like moths to a flame, the morbid allure of the unknown proving too strong to resist. I threw myself into my work, determined to keep as many people safe as I could. I patrolled the trails tirelessly, working double shifts and sleeping fitfully in my cabin. The woods felt increasingly hostile, the very air heavy with malice. I woke from dreams of being watched by pitiless, inhuman eyes, the taste of decaying leaves thick on my tongue. Then the first body was found. A dark tourism vlogger who had slipped away from his group to try to catch a glimpse of the creature. His remains were scattered, torn, partly consumed. The official line was that he must have surprised a bear and been mauled to death. But I had seen the claw marks gouged into the nearby trees, far too large for any bear. I knew the truth, even if I could scarcely bring myself to acknowledge it. The forest had claimed its first victim. It wouldn't be the last. Hysteria gripped the park. Campers packed up and fled, abandoning equipment in their haste. Rangers spoke in hushed murmurs of walking off the job, unwilling to risk their lives. Every bush and shadow seemed to conceal a lurking threat. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to leave. Call it stubbornness. Call it a misplaced sense of duty. The forest had sunk its claws into me and wouldn't let go. I was bound to this place now, for better or worse. I thought back to the injured hiker's story about his grandfather, the tobacco and sage bundles carried for protection, the offerings left by the local tribes to appease the spirits. There had to be a way to coexist with the beings in the woods, ancient rules and rites to follow to avoid inciting their anger. I had to believe that. The alternative, that we were helpless in the face of an all-consuming, incomprehensible evil, was too terrible to contemplate. I began to seek out the tribal elders, asking for their wisdom, their stories. At first, they were reluctant to share with an outsider. But as I spoke of my encounters, the horrors I had witnessed, something in my words must have rung true. They recognized one who had been touched by the Mayanganaki. Night after night, I sat with them around flickering fires, listening to the old legends, committing to memory the signs and portents of the dark being's presence. I learned the proper prayers and offerings, which parts of the forest to avoid at which phases of the moon. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a thin thread of hope to cling to. I knew I could never truly defeat the beings that lurked in the UP woods. They were ancient, powerful, and utterly without mercy. But maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to appease them, to broker an uneasy truce between their world and ours. If not, I feared for the lives of every soul who set foot in the forest, and for my own sanity, such as it was. The only thing I knew for certain, I would never leave this place. The forest had claimed me, for good or ill. I belong to it now, for better or worse, till death do us part. The final incident goes down in UP legend as the massacre at Miners Falls. A group of college students up from Michigan State on a weekend trip decided to set up camp at the trailhead for the falls, despite all warnings. Told themselves the ranger reports were exaggerated, promotional myths to draw in tourists. Disregarded the signs posted at every path leading to that part of the woods, the ones that read, "Area closed, do not enter on pain of death." He even brought along a couple shotguns and enough beer to embolden them into reckless stupidity. Their campfire could be seen flickering between the trees as dusk fell, drawing the attention of God only knows what. The screams started around 2 a.m., shattering the still night air and sending animals scattering in all directions. Those that heard it and survived claimed that no earthly human or beast could make noises like that. Like reality itself was being torn asunder, an auditory rip in the fabric of the universe through which gibbered the screams of the damned. By the time I arrived on scene with 2 other rangers, the woods were deathly silent. Nothing remained of the camp but the smoldering remains of a fire. And blood. Blood everywhere. Splashed across tree trunks, soaking into the leaf-littered ground. Bits of torn flesh scattered about like the leavings of any other large predator. No bodies, though. Not a single one. Just threads of viscera here and there. The occasional scrap of bloody fabric or a glint of shattered bone. I collapsed to my knees, revulsion and shock rising in my throat. My companions wept openly, calling for backup on shaking radios. But I knew no backup would help those poor fools now. They had entered the forest with arrogance and disregard, and the forest had exacted its terrible price. In that moment, my resolve hardened into adamantine certainty. This could not keep happening. I would not allow more innocent blood to soak into the roots of these trees, an unending sacrifice to sate the hunger of beings more ancient than mankind itself. If the demons in the woods demanded tribute, I would see that it was paid, but at a price of my own naming. I rose and entered the woods alone. For 3 days and nights I walked those haunted trails, leaving offerings, chanting the words the elders had taught me, repurposed my own sweat and blood into benedictions of protection and appeasement. I told the Maingan Aki that enough was enough. They had made their point. Any further trespass would be punished in ways both swift and terrible. But those who respected the forest and observed the proper rites would be allowed to pass unharmed. A balance must be struck. Madness, hubris, call it what you will. But I like to think that some force heard my words, acknowledged the compact I had struck. In the years since, those who heed the warnings and leave the required tributes have walked out of the UP woods unscathed. But the closed area signs remain. Because while the beings that lurk in the forest may tolerate us, they do not forgive. And they do not forget. As for me, I remain the steadfast warden of this uneasy truce, the guardian at the threshold between the world of men and the realm of nightmares. I walk the trails, tend the totems, and ensure the offerings are made. More than ever, the UP woods feel like home. I know the truth now, you see. For all our supposed dominion over the earth, humanity is still at the mercy of powers we can barely comprehend. The national parks may belong to the people, but the deep, dark heart of the forest will always belong to the Maingan Aki, and so I remain, watchful, wary, wondering constantly if each new day will be the one where the ancient pact is broken, where the delicate equilibrium tilts towards chaos and slaughter once more. It's a hell of a thing, the mantles we choose to wear. But I suppose there are worse fates than being the ranger at the end of the world. My name is Robert Smith, and I am 72 years old. What I'm about to recount happened to me on September 17, 1993, a date forever etched in my memory. It was supposed to be just another ordinary weekend camping trip in my RV, something I did often to escape the relentless hustle of my job in Chicago. Little did I know that this particular trip would change my life forever. I remember waking up early that Friday morning, the cool autumn air seeping through my bedroom window. At 41 years old, I was in the prime of my life, a successful marketing executive with a corner office overlooking the Chicago skyline. But the corporate world had begun to wear on me, and these weekend getaways had become my lifeline, a way to reconnect with nature and find some peace. I packed my trusty 1985 Winnebago, a 26-foot behemoth that had been my faithful companion on countless adventures. As I loaded up my fishing gear, camping supplies, and enough food to last the weekend, I felt the familiar excitement building. This time, my destination was a secluded spot near the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania. The drive from Chicago to Pennsylvania was long but pleasant. I took my time, enjoying the changing landscape as urban sprawl gave way to rolling hills and dense forests. The leaves were just beginning to turn, splashing the countryside with hints of gold and crimson. I stopped at a small diner in Ohio for lunch, savoring a hearty plate of meatloaf and mashed potatoes while chatting with the friendly waitress about local attractions. As the sun began to dip low on the horizon, I finally approached my destination. This place wasn't on any major map, just a secluded nook I'd stumbled upon by accident years ago during one of my aimless wanderings. It had a small clearing by a creek, surrounded by dense trees, perfect for some quiet contemplation. I carefully maneuvered the RV down the narrow dirt road, branches scraping against the sides as I pushed deeper into the forest. The fading daylight filtered through the canopy, casting long shadows across my path. After about a mile, the trees opened up to reveal the familiar clearing. With a sigh of contentment, I parked the RV and stepped out, stretching my legs after the long drive. The air was crisp and filled with the earthy scent of decaying leaves and damp soil. The babbling of the nearby creek provided a soothing backdrop as I began to set up camp. I unfurled my favorite outdoor rug in front of the RV, creating a small patio area, Next came the folding table and chairs, my portable propane grill, and a stack of firewood I'd brought along. As I worked, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in my little home away from home. The Winnebago might not have been the newest or fanciest RV out there, but it was mine, and it represented freedom. With camp set up, I decided to take a short hike before it got too dark. I grabbed my walking stick and a small backpack with some water and trail mix, then set off down a faint path leading deeper into the woods. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds settling in for the night and small animals scurrying through the underbrush. As I walked, I let my mind wander, thinking about my life back in Chicago. My job was demanding, often requiring long hours and high-stress meetings. I was good at what I did, but lately, I'd been feeling unfulfilled. These camping trips were becoming more than just a hobby. They were a lifeline, a glimpse of a simpler existence that I found myself craving more and more. I returned to camp just as the last rays of sunlight were disappearing behind the trees. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and I shivered slightly as I set about building a fire. Soon, the crackling flames cast a warm glow across the clearing, and I settled into my chair with a contented sigh. Dinner that night was simple but satisfying. A can of beef stew heated over the fire, accompanied by a couple of slices of crusty bread I'd picked up at a bakery on the way. As I ate, I gazed up at the night sky, marveling at the countless stars visible here, far from the light pollution of the city. After dinner, I cleaned up and secured the campsite, making sure all food was safely stored in the RV to avoid attracting any curious wildlife. I then retreated to the comfort of my Winnebago, settling in with a dog-eared paperback I'd been meaning to finish for weeks. As I read, I could hear the gentle sounds of the forest outside, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, the occasional hoot of an owl, the distant yip of a coyote. It was a peaceful symphony that soon lulled me into a deep, dreamless sleep. I awoke early the next morning, just as the first rays of sunlight were beginning to filter through the trees. The air inside the RV was chilly, and I could see my breath as I fumbled for my glasses on the nightstand. I pulled on a warm fleece and my favorite pair of well-worn hiking boots before stepping outside to greet the day. The clearing was shrouded in a light mist, giving it an almost ethereal quality. Dew clung to every surface, sparkling like diamonds in the early morning light. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the crisp, clean air, and felt a sense of peace wash over me. After a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and strong black coffee, I grabbed my fishing gear and headed down to the creek. The water was clear and cold, rushing over smooth stones and creating small eddies where I knew the fish liked to hide. I found a comfortable spot on the bank and cast my line, settling in for a morning of quiet contemplation. As I fished, I let my mind wander. I thought about my life back in Chicago, the pressures of work, the constant noise and hustle of the city. Out here, surrounded by nature, those concerns seemed distant and insignificant. I found myself wondering, not for the first time, what it would be like to leave it all behind and embrace a simpler life. The hours slipped by, almost unnoticed. By midday, I had caught 2 decent-sized trout, which I cleaned and stored in the RV's small refrigerator for dinner. Feeling invigorated by my success, I decided to spend the afternoon exploring the surrounding forest. I packed a small day pack with water, some trail mix, and a first aid kit, then set off down one of the faint trails leading away from the clearing. The forest was dense, with towering oak and maple trees creating a canopy high above. Shafts of sunlight broke through here and there, illuminating patches of ferns and wildflowers on the forest floor. As I hiked, I kept my eyes and ears open for signs of wildlife. I spotted several deer tracks in the soft earth and even caught a glimpse of a red fox darting through the underbrush. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and small animals, a constant reminder of the vibrant ecosystem surrounding me. About 2 miles from camp, I came across a small, hidden waterfall. The stream tumbled down a series of rocky ledges, creating a mesmerizing display of rushing water and mist. I sat on a moss-covered log nearby, pulling out my notepad to sketch the scene. I wasn't much of an artist, but I enjoyed trying to capture the beauty of the natural world in my own clumsy way. As the afternoon wore on, I made my way back to camp, taking a different route to explore more of the area. The forest seemed to change character as the day progressed, shadows lengthening and the ambient sounds shifting as diurnal creatures bedded down and nocturnal ones began to stir. I arrived back at the clearing just as the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across my campsite. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and I quickly set about building a fire. Soon the crackling flames cast a warm glow across the area, pushing back the encroaching darkness. Dinner that night was a feast by camping standards. I pan-fried the trout I had caught earlier, seasoning them with lemon and herbs I had brought from home. Alongside, I prepared some instant mashed potatoes and opened a can of green beans. As I sat by the fire, savoring my meal and sipping a cold beer, I felt a deep sense of contentment. After dinner, I cleaned up, making sure to store all food securely in the RV to avoid attracting animals. Then I settled into my folding chair by the fire, gazing up at the star-filled sky. Out here, away from the light pollution of the city, the Milky Way was clearly visible, a river of stars stretching across the heavens. As the fire burned down to embers, I found myself reflecting on the day. It had been perfect in its simplicity. Fishing, hiking, enjoying nature. I thought about my job back in Chicago, the stress and pressure that seemed to consume my life. Out here, none of that mattered. I felt a pang of regret at the thought of returning to that world in just a couple of days. Little did I know that my peaceful reverie was about to be shattered. As I sat there, lost in thought, I had no idea that in just a few short hours, my life would take a turn into the realm of the unexplainable and terrifying. It was around midnight when I first heard it, a rustling in the bushes nearby. At first, I dismissed it as nothing unusual, probably just a raccoon or a deer moving through the underbrush. The forest was full of nocturnal creatures, after all. I took another sip of my beer, enjoying the last remnants of warmth from the dying fire. But then I heard something else, a sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was a low, distinct gurgling noise, unlike any animal I recognized. It sounded almost human, but distorted, as if someone was trying to speak through water. I sat up straighter in my chair, all senses suddenly on high alert. The gurgling sound came again, louder this time, and accompanied by the cracking of twigs as if something was moving through the forest towards me. My first thought was that someone might be in trouble. Perhaps a hiker had fallen into the creek and was struggling to call for help. Despite the growing sense of unease in the pit of my stomach, I knew I couldn't ignore a potential cry for help. I grabbed my flashlight from the table next to me, its weight reassuring in my hand. The beam cut through the darkness as I swung it towards the source of the sound, illuminating the underbrush and the trees beyond my campsite. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet forest. "Is anyone there? Do you need help?" There was no answer, just that persistent gurgling sound. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the creek, about 20 yards from where I stood. I took a deep breath, steeling my nerves, and started walking towards it. The forest seemed different at night, familiar landmarks transformed into looming shadows. My flashlight beam bounced off tree trunks and undergrowth, creating a tunnel of light through the darkness. With each step, the gurgling grew louder, interspersed now with a wet slapping sound that I couldn't identify. As I approached the creek, my light fell upon something that made me stop in my tracks. There, half submerged in the shallow water, was a small, overturned canoe. It was old and covered in moss, something I had never noticed during my daytime explorations of the area. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The canoe looked like it had been there for years, its wood weathered and beginning to rot. But if that was the case, How had I never seen it before? As I stood there trying to make sense of what I was seeing, the gurgling sound stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was even more unnerving than the noise had been. I swung my flashlight around wildly, half expecting to see an injured hiker or some lost camper emerging from the trees. But there was nothing. Just the quiet creek and the dense darkness beyond my flashlight's reach. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool night air. Something felt wrong, deeply and fundamentally wrong. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to get back to the safety of my RV. I started to turn, intending to do just that, when I caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye. I swung the flashlight quickly in that direction, but whatever it was had vanished. All I saw was the shifting shadows of leaves in the breeze. That was enough for me. I turned and began walking quickly back towards my campsite, trying to keep my pace steady despite the urge to break into a run. The forest seemed to close in around me, branches reaching out like grasping fingers, shadows deepening and shifting in ways that didn't seem natural. When I finally reached the clearing, I was out of breath, my heart racing. The campfire had burned down to just a few glowing embers, casting an eerie, faint light across the site. Without hesitation, I headed straight for my RV, locking the door behind me as soon as I was inside. I sat down heavily on the small sofa, trying to calm my ragged breathing. What had just happened? Was I letting my imagination run wild, spooked by unfamiliar sounds in the dark? Or had there really been something out there? Something that didn't belong in these woods? As I sat there, replaying the events in my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the RV settling, every rustle of leaves outside, sent a fresh wave of unease through me. Sleep, I knew, would be a long time coming. Despite my racing thoughts and the lingering sense of unease, exhaustion eventually caught up with me. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a sound that made my blood run cold, a rhythmic thumping on the side of the RV. At first, in my groggy state, I thought it might be a branch blown by the wind, but as I became more alert, I realized the sound was too regular, too deliberate. It was almost like someone, or something, was knocking. I sat up in my bunk, heart pounding so loud I was sure it must be audible outside the RV. The knocking continued, growing louder and more insistent with each passing second. It seemed to be moving, circling the vehicle, as if whatever was out there was testing for weak points. I reached for the baseball bat I kept next to my bed for protection, its solid weight providing a small measure of comfort. With my other hand, I fumbled for my flashlight, nearly dropping it in my nervousness. The knocking stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so profound it seemed to press against my eardrums. I held my breath, straining to hear any sound from outside. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, just as I was beginning to think I had imagined it all, I heard something else. A soft scraping sound, like nails or claws dragging slowly across the metal exterior of the RV. A whimper escaped my throat before I could stop it. I clapped a hand over my mouth, irrationally afraid that whatever was out there might hear me. The scraping continued, moving from the side of the RV towards the door. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there waiting for whatever it was to find a way in. With trembling hands, I got to my feet, gripping the baseball bat so tightly my knuckles turned white. I crept towards the door, each step feeling like it took an eternity. The scraping had stopped, but I could hear something else now. A wet, gurgling sound, like the one I had heard earlier by the creek, but closer. Much closer. My hand hovered over the door handle. Every fiber of my being was screaming at me to run, to hide, to do anything but open that door. But I knew I had to face whatever was out there. I couldn't spend the rest of the night jumping at every sound, imagining horrors lurking in the darkness. Taking a deep breath, I yanked the door open and swung my flashlight around wildly, the bat raised and ready to strike. The campsite was empty. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the familiar shapes of my folding chairs, the smoldering remains of the campfire, the surrounding trees. But there was no sign of any intruder, no monstrous shape lurking in the shadows. I stood there for a long moment, my heart racing, ears straining for any sound out of the ordinary. But all I could hear was the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze and the distant hooting of an owl. Just as I was about to convince myself it had all been a vivid nightmare, my flashlight beam caught something that made my blood run cold. There, in the soft dirt in front of the RV, was a set of footprints. But these were unlike any footprints I'd ever seen before. They were elongated, almost twice the length of a normal human foot, with strange, claw-like indentations at the tips of what should have been toes. And they were fresh, the edges still crisp in the damp soil. My hands shaking, I followed the trail with my flashlight. The footprints led away from the RV, towards the creek where I had heard the strange noises earlier. Without fully realizing what I was doing, I found myself following them, drawn by a morbid curiosity that overrode my fear. The forest seemed to close in around me as I walked, the trees looming overhead, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Every shadow seemed to hide some nameless horror, every rustle of leaves a potential threat. As I approached the creek, I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. The old, moss-covered canoe I had discovered earlier was no longer overturned. It sat upright at the water's edge, as if waiting for a passenger. But it wasn't the canoe that held my attention. It was the object next to it, a small, leather-bound book that seemed to glow faintly in the beam of my flashlight. Against my better judgment, I approached and picked up the book. It was old, the leather cracked and worn, with strange symbols embossed on the cover that I didn't recognize from any language I knew. With trembling hands, I opened it. The pages were filled with dense, handwritten text in the same unfamiliar script, interspersed with drawings that made my skin crawl. There were sketches of creatures that couldn't possibly exist, things with too many limbs, distorted features, and eyes that seemed to stare out from the page with malevolent intelligence. One drawing, in particular, caught my eye. It depicted a tall, impossibly thin figure with elongated limbs and no discernible face. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the creature's feet matched the strange prints I had been following. A twig snapped behind me, and I whirled around, dropping the book in my panic. The beam of my flashlight danced wildly across the trees, but I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. Then I heard it. That wet, gurgling sound, closer than ever before. It seemed to be coming from just beyond the reach of my light, hidden in the shadows between the trees. I backed away slowly, my eyes darting from side to side, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. My foot hit something, and I nearly fell backward into the creek. It was the book I had dropped. Without thinking, I snatched it up and turned to run back to the RV. That's when I felt it. A cold, clammy hand grasping my ankle. I screamed and kicked out instinctively, my foot connecting with something solid. The grip on my ankle loosened, and I scrambled away, not daring to look back. I ran through the forest, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. I could hear something moving behind me, crashing through the underbrush with inhuman speed. When I finally burst into the clearing where my RV was parked, I was gasping for breath, my lungs burning. I didn't stop until I was inside, the door locked firmly behind me. For the rest of the night, I sat in the driver's seat, the baseball bat across my lap, staring out into the darkness. The knocking started again sometime before dawn, moving around the RV, tapping at each window in turn. But I didn't dare look out, afraid of what I might see pressed against the glass. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, the knocking finally stopped. I waited another hour until the sun was fully up, before I finally worked up the courage to start the engine. I tore out of that clearing like a man possessed, not stopping until I reached the small town of Warren, nearly 50 miles away. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely put the RV in park. I went straight to the local sheriff's office, the leather-bound book clutched tightly to my chest. The deputy on duty listened to my story with a mix of concern and skepticism. He radioed a couple of officers to check out the campsite, but I knew they wouldn't find anything. Whatever had been there, I was certain it wouldn't have left any evidence behind. Sure enough, when the deputies returned, they reported finding nothing out of the ordinary. No footprints, no overturned canoe, no signs of any disturbance. They suggested it might have been a vivid nightmare brought on by spending the night alone in the woods. But I knew what I had seen, what I had experienced, and I had the book as proof. Its weight a constant reminder that the events of that night were all too real. I didn't go camping again for a long time after that. When I finally did, it was in well-populated campgrounds, surrounded by other people. But I never felt truly safe in the woods again. In the years that followed, I did extensive research into the area where I had camped. I discovered old legends about a creature known as the Pale Wanderer, said to haunt the forests of Pennsylvania. The descriptions matched what I had seen: a tall, emaciated figure with unnaturally long limbs and a face hidden in shadow. The book remained in my possession, a constant source of fascination and dread. I had it analyzed by experts in ancient languages and cryptography, but no one could decipher its contents. The symbols seemed to shift and change when examined too closely, and several researchers reported vivid nightmares after prolonged exposure to the text. Now, nearly 3 decades later, I still wake up some nights in a cold sweat, the memory of that gurgling sound echoing in my ears. I've long since moved to the city, trading the quiet of nature for the comforting buzz of constant human activity. But sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I catch a whiff of damp earth and decaying leaves. And for a moment, I'm back in those woods, with something unnatural lurking just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I don't know if what I encountered that night was some undiscovered creature, a ghost, or something beyond human understanding. But I do know this: there are things in this world that defy explanation. Things that lurk in the dark corners of the wilderness, waiting for unwary travelers to stumble upon them. And if you ever find yourself alone in the woods, hearing strange noises in the night, remember my story. Because sometimes the monsters in the dark are all too real. As I sit here in my apartment in downtown Chicago, the leather-bound book rests on my desk, a constant reminder of that fateful night. I've often thought about destroying it, burning it to ashes and scattering them to the wind. But something always stops me. Perhaps it's the fear that destroying the book might somehow summon whatever creature it's connected to. Or maybe it's the lingering hope that one day I'll uncover its secrets and finally understand what happened to me. I've never shared the full story publicly before now. Who would believe me? A 72-year-old man spinning tales of monsters in the woods? But I feel compelled to record it now, to pass on this warning to others who might venture into the dark places of the world. To this day, I can't explain everything that happened during those terrifying hours in the Allegheny National Forest. Was it all real, or some sort of hallucination brought on by isolation and fear? The rational part of my mind wants to dismiss it, to file it away as a bad dream or a trick of the light. But then I look at the book, its cover still unmarked by age despite the decades that have passed, and I know the truth. There are things in this world beyond our understanding, creatures that exist in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. So if you're reading this, take heed. The next time you're in the woods and you hear a strange noise in the night, don't dismiss it. Don't go investigating. And if you hear a wet, gurgling sound like someone trying to speak through water, run. Run as fast and as far as you can, because the Pale Wanderer is out there waiting in the shadows, and not everyone who encounters it lives to tell the tale.